offending religious sensibilities, inciting revolution, anti-democratic propaganda. For all this, one of antiquity's greatest thinkers, Socrates, would be accused and instantly permabanned on Twitch today. How often have I had to listen to the absolute poppycock that Socrates was sentenced to death for? Honestly, in ancient Greece everyone but the eunuchs was at it, and it's high time we stopped shoehorning modern legal and moral standards into events from 2500 years ago. Furthermore, tourists are far too often led to this hole in the rock and taught it is the very prison where Socrates drank his poison. Rubbish, heavens, but rubbish. Allow me to explain everything in due order. In a small park on the hill opposite the legendary Athenian Acropolis a small cave hides in the undergrowth, once part of a building complex. Dozens of tour groups visit this spot daily, and more often than not, what comes out of the guides' mouths is not exactly a lie, but certainly unverified information. God as my witness, I try to be as civil as possible in my subjective judgments. It is the unverified claim that this site is the ruins of the famous ancient prison where the great philosopher Socrates was held. The myth, which emerged in the early 19th century, when Athens was still a provincial town within a Turkish Islamic caliphate, rather like modern Germany, was born without malice. A simple English clergyman, Thomas Smart Hughes, was smart enough for his time, but in the early 19th century prompt engineering didn't exist, and fact-checking was no easy feat. So when the locals showed Pastor Hughes this cave and told him it was where the great Socrates spent his final days, the pastor didn't doubt it for a second and noted it down in his journals. All subsequent studies of the site relied on this very theory, that this was the former Athenian jail. Then suddenly Plato comes to the rescue. Another remarkable Greek philosopher who today would likely be sent the same way as Socrates for his broad critique of the democratic system. In his dialogue, Phaedo, Plato, Socrates' pupil and an eyewitness of his final days, describes the prison in some detail. Based on Plato's text, it becomes clear that the prison facet faced the main street. It contained a bathhouse. Considering that Socrates' execution took place in 399 BC, this prison must have been built before that date. Equipped with this data and Pastor Hughes' notes on the holes in the rock, archaeological excavations were carried out in the mid-19th century. Indeed, an extension that once existed in front of the caves had a facet facing the main street. There could well have been a bath inside, or a lutron to use the correct ancient Greek term, and to top it off, a marble statue of a bearded old man was found during the dig, immediately attributed as a portrait of Socrates. Bingo! There is your tourist attraction. Set up a ticket booth, 20 euros ahead, discounts for pensioners and minors, and don't forget the magnets and t-shirts with quotes on your way out. It would seem the evidence is all there, so what's the problem? If you consult a truly good guidebook to Athens, for instance this one, which quite by chance was written by your humble servant, you will find that one of the vast territory between the Theseo and Monastiraki districts and the foot of the Acropolis, there existed until 1930s a densely built-up residential area called Vrissaki. For centuries its inhabitants quite happily built their pigsties and chicken coops atop ancient ruins, grazed their sheep, dried their laundry and burnt ancient sculptures into lime, never imagining the priceless archaeological finds hidden in their backyards. Fortunately for the Greek Ministry of Tourism, the residents' eyes were opened by the American School of Classical Studies, which received exclusive rights from the Greek government to excavate Vrissaki. The Americans approached the matter with typical American scale. They cleared all the locals out to new districts and, demolished everything built after the 3rd century AD, save for one lonely Byzantine church. The Greek authorities intervened for that one. It turned out that beneath Vrysaki lay the ancient Athenian Agora, the cultural and political heart of Athens, the most important and sacred place in the city, trodden by the bare feet of Socrates, Plato, Attalus, Diogenes, and every other character from deep antiquity. Among other things, the ruins of a certain building were discovered on the Agora, its facade facing on the central street. This building was a stone's throw from the main court of ancient Athens, and in its structure closely resembled a prison. A long gallery with 5 rooms on the right and 3 on the left. At the end was an open-air courtyard for exercise. Furthermore, the remains of a square extension are visible, most likely a bathhouse for prisoners. During the excavations, many small clay vessels of identical size were found, exactly like those used in ancient pharmacies for sealing medical mixtures. Since the building hardly fit the structure of a classical ancient pharmacy, the only reasonable theory of archaeologists was a prison. The fact is, the capital punishment for an Athenian citizen in Socrates' time was death, but not by hanging or beheading, sovereign curse, but by compelling a free Athenian to commit suicide by drinking poison. This is exactly how Socrates died, carrying out the court sentence. Thus, it became obvious to archaeologists that the most likely place of Socrates' death was not the ruins on the hill described by Pastor Hughes, but a standard penitentiary in the city's administrative center. But, of course, these grass-overgrown heaps of stones, the remains of an ancient foundation, are far less impressive to the average tourist than a whole semi-cave on a hillside with the best view of the Acropolis in town. So, to this day, nearly a century after the discovery of the actual Socrates prison, some guides continue to lead their unsuspecting clients to that poor hell. Socrates is guilty of not honoring the gods the city honors, but of introducing new deities and corrupting the youth. The punishment for this is death. Such, according to the historian Diogenes Laertius, was the verdict brought against the great philosopher by the city court, the dicastery, a peculiar institution where citizens chosen by lot, publicly and in front of a vast number of presiding judges, from 201 to 6,000 people, depending on the severity of the case, delivered final, unappealable sentence to their fellow Athenians. Yes, any citizen could become a judge in ancient Athens, simply by luck of the draw. No special education was required. One only needed to be a free Athenian male of the correct age. Female citizens were excluded from political life, they only right being in certain cases to prevent their husbands from spending their dowries. Slaves, who numbered around 100,000 in Socrates' era, and metics, residents of non-Athenian origin, about 10,000 people, were also deprived of all civil rights. At the same time, there were no more than 21,000 free citizens in the ancient polis in the 4th century BC, over half of whom were women and children. This is the great and often ignored paradox of Athenian democracy. All this supposed equality and freedom of this system applied fully only to 5 or 10% of the population who lived mostly of slave labor. Yes, classical, ubiquitous slavery was the reason free Athenians could quietly pursue science, art, rhetoric, politics, and the contemplation of the night sky. The price of a male slave in the 4th century BC was between 70 and 130 drachmas. A female slave was up to 200 drachmas. Thus, a typical Athenian artisan could save up for a slave in less than a year. For this reason, there wasn't a single family in Socrates' Athens, even the poorest, without at least one slave to do the bulk of the dirty work for their masters. And so the most just final court of free and equal men gathers to judge one of their own. What was Socrates' crime? He was an oral philosopher. He never wrote anything himself, merely walked the colonnades of the Athenian Agora surrounded by his pupils, who in turn recorded the words of their great teacher, Plato being one of them. It is known that one of Socrates' core ideas was the so-called daimonion, a mystical inner voice which, according to the philosopher, warned him against wrong actions and occasionally gave him abstract advices. For instance, 16 years before his execution, citing his daimonion, Socrates tried to warn the Athenians against sending their fleet to Sicily to capture Syracuse. Socrates warned that the expedition would end in disaster, but democracy decided otherwise. In 413 BC, the fleet was destroyed, and 4 of Athens' greatest generals perished. Many later researchers were inclined to see the daimonion as a mere metaphor for Socrates' own reason and conscience. For his contemporaries, however, who worshipped very specific gods of the pagan pantheon, tales of daimonion were seen as blasphemy. If pupils listened to their teachers in a voice, the public feared they might turn away from the cult of Athena, Zeus and Apollo. The most democratic society of antiquity, which so many modern republics later tried to emulate, could not tolerate this. Indeed, one of Socrates' contemporaries, the philosopher Protagoras, was sentenced to eternal exile for the single thought that human life is too short and the mind too insignificant for us to form any clear idea whether gods actually exist or not. Furthermore, Socrates considered the Athenian system exceptionally inefficient, a crowd of randomly selected blocks deciding the fate of society through long emotional discussions, with all the city's most important issues settled at the ecclesia, the assembly, where the deciding vote went to the common mob. Socrates believed that power should belong only to the most worthy members of society, and that only life, wisdom, and deep knowledge could be the source of the virtue required for a true ruler. Whether it was his ideas on the daimonion or his critique of the state, these were likely the main reasons for his prosecution. As for Socrates' relationships with his underage pupils, this was a standard part of the curriculum for youth across ancient Greece. It was believed such bonds strengthened the spiritual connection between master and student. However appealing this may be to our modern morals, to claim Socrates was punished for this is the height of amateurism. If anyone tries to tell you otherwise, tell them to go back and reread the basics. Thus, Athenian democracy rid itself of one of its most outstanding citizens, a story that will never lose its relevance.